One last thing here that I wanted to get to today, Friday, a statement by Christopher Ingram in the Washington Post that democracy is in retreat around the globe, everywhere. And that's according to the latest annual report from Freedom House, which is a civil liberties watchdog organization. And this new report says that the situation is especially concerning here in the United States, where they say a decade of creeping authoritarianism. No, it's been 4 decades. I beg to differ. But they say a decade of creeping authoritarianism has produced one of the world's most rapid paces of democratic deterioration. Here, us. That's according to the report. And the report goes on to say that in terms of individual freedom, we're now, quote, closer to countries such as Romania and Panama than Western European partners like France and Germany. Yeah. And Christopher Ingram says in his article here, there's a major economic component to our recent decline as well. And that's this horrendous divide between rich and poor in this country. And researchers who study this, the economists or demographers or whoever, have found that divide is both a cause and a consequence of the shredding of democracy here and around the country, around the planet. So it's not, when they say 10 years, and I differ with that, but when they say 10 years, they're referring to this hideous gap in the accumulation of wealth or the lack thereof that has turned this country into the 1%, which has any goddamn thing they could possibly want plus, and the 99% who don't have that option. And according to the report, the United States scores particularly poorly on equal treatment under the law. Well, we don't need a report to tell us that, do we? Well, maybe some of my white brothers and sisters would find that revelatory, but people of color, they've known this forever. And it goes on to say that in the workplace, a large compensation gap between white men and virtually everyone else, quote, has remained relatively constant over the past several decades, end quote. That's according to the report. And the report goes on to say, quote, long-running and interrelated disparities in education and housing, end quote, are another major area of concern. Black home ownership rates continued to fall from their peak in 2004, according to the report, driven in part by mortgage discrimination against non-whites, or as we used to say back in the 70s, redlining. The red line that you can't cross. White, you're all right. Black, get back. Red, you're dead. Remember that? Maybe you don't. In the United States, home ownership is both the engine of middle-class wealth and a major determinant of quality public schooling. Yes, it is, isn't it? And the higher the property values in a given school district, the better the education opportunities in the local schools will be. Because, and this is insanity, this is madness, the quality of our schools depends on property tax. Well, if you have a neighborhood of, say, all $600,000, $700,000 homes over here, and a neighborhood over here of all $60,000 and $70,000 homes, quick pop quiz. Which area do you think, gentle listener, is going to have the better school? Time's up. Right. The ones with the $600,000, $700,000 homes. That's the way it is. That's the way it's always been. And that's what has to stop. If we are going to attempt to find an equality of opportunity in education, then doesn't it hold that we also have to find a more equitable way of funding our local schools? I mean, seriously, come on. You don't need to be an economist or an education specialist or anybody with anything more than a fifth grade education to figure this one out. Once you're given the fact being that schools are financed by property taxes, and property taxes are dependent on the value of the property. Ta-da! So as a result of that, there is this massive wealth gap, so-called, between white and black American families. And the report goes on to say the United States is also deficient in the realm of, quote, equality of opportunity and freedom from economic exploitation, end quote. It goes on to say that the American dream, quote, the notion of a fair society in which hard work will bring economic and social advancement regardless of the circumstances of one's birth, end quote, is faltering in a society that now has one of the lowest rates of upward mobility in the so-called wealthy world. You knew this, though, didn't you? Of course. I knew it too. It's all around us. Anyway, back to this report. It says the share of Americans earning more money than their parents has plummeted, driven by something we all are very familiar with, the stagnation of wages over the past 3 or 4 decades, except for that top 1%. Or more specifically, the top 1/2 of 1%, or if you really want to get funky, the top 1/10 of 1%. They have done just fabulously. The federal minimum wage that the right-wingers in the Christian Fascist Party are just wetting their pants over, raising, hasn't been raised in over a decade. Oh, well, that's okay because there's been no inflation. You see? The pandemic, the Trump pandemic, because of the asininity of this son of a bitch and his refusal to recognize what the science was telling the people who understood the science, who would then try to report it to him. The pandemic ushered in this massive wave of layoffs and unsafe working conditions for the millions of people who do that essential frontline work of keeping the country running. And that includes everybody from the doctors and nurses and ambulance drivers and hospital workers to people who run convenience stores and lunch counters and coffee shops and restaurants. And just on and on and on. Frontline workers. People who bust their ass in 1 or 2 or 3 jobs trying to pay the fucking rent and feed the children. Well, the top 1% laugh and chortle and giggle and go off on their Cancun vacations, right? But the Freedom House report that I am liberally quoting from here, no pun intended, underscores how inequality and authoritarianism, and I would add Christian fascism, reinforce each other. How so? Well, researchers have found that when people are unable to improve their economic situation through hard work, they come to believe that the system is rigged against them. And then that becomes fertile recruiting areas for crazy fuckers like the Cucumbers or the Proud Boys or the Republican Party or Christian fascists or Donald Trump It becomes very easy for that kind of slime and scum and revolting factions of society to emerge when people feel they're being fucked by the system because the system is rigged against them. And that's when people are more likely to support authoritarianism. Or a populist, phony son of a bitch like Donald Trump, who promised to do things like drain the swamp or make America great again. You see how this works? Of course. I know you know this, but it warrants talking about anyway. And last year, there was a UN report that said, quote, the central message of populist movements has historically been that the common people are being exploited by a privileged elite, and that radical institutional change is required to avoid such exploitation, end quote. Now, that is a very fair, legitimate, right on target statement. But when that statement is taken by a filthy pig subhuman like Donald Trump and twisted, Donald Trump, this multimillionaire, he's full of shit about his net wealth. I don't care what it is. But this privileged son of a bitch, Donald Trump, and his privileged fucked up children, and his privileged fucked up married into sons and daughters-in-law or whatever. And when they take this message, this populist message that is legitimate, and twist it into an unrecognizable form that is designed to guarantee their ascendancy, or they're maintaining their ascendant positions and keep the rest of us fighting each other, that's when I lose my fucking mind and want to grab the nearest club. Against them. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcasts. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.